The $185,000 Patek Philippe watch gleamed ominously on Samuel Montgomery's wrist as his manicured fingers tapped an impatient rhythmic beat against the pristine white linen tablecloth. It was a highly calculated gesture of profound arrogance, a visible display of raw corporate power from a wealthy man, thoroughly accustomed to the entire world, bending entirely to his specific rhythm and desires. Sarah Davis. Mitchell had been standing on her aching feet for 6 exhausting hours, completely ignoring the sharp pain radiating from her perfectly polished, half-heeled black shoes that were unfortunately half a size too small. They were the absolute only presentable pair she owned, meticulously maintained to meet the impossibly high standards of the ultra-luxury Manhattan establishment where she desperately worked to keep her small family from starving. Her spotless uniform, consisting of an immaculate white blouse, a modest knee-length black skirt, and a heavily starched apron, cleverly hid the harsh, painful truth of her daily grinding existence in the city. It effectively concealed the unfortunate fact that she had breakfasted on nothing but watered-down cheap coffee because her meager minimum wage salary would simply not stretch until her scheduled payday on Friday. It hid the heartbreaking reality that her elderly grandmother, Grace, waited in their tiny apartment with painfully swollen knees, entirely lacking the necessary funds for her essential, incredibly expensive prescription medicines. Every single step Sarah took across the highly polished floors of that exclusive restaurant was a silent, incredibly fierce act of resistance against gnawing, hunger-crushing societal defeat and the threat of total oblivion. Yet absolutely nobody sitting in that glittering, opulent dining room looked at Sarah with even an ounce of genuine human recognition or basic respect. They simply looked right through her tired body. They only saw a nameless, faceless waitress, a mechanical entity whose sole purpose in life was to flawlessly serve $400 plates of gourmet food and pour $800 glasses of vintage wine. The prestigious establishment, famously known as the Manhattan Pinnacle, proudly occupied the exclusive 32nd floor of the Diamond Tower, widely considered the most expensive commercial building in New York City. Valued at a staggering $2.3 billion, the restaurant featured immense floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the illuminated city spreading out below them like a magnificent blanket of fallen stars. Sarah professionally approached Table 14 with her small leather-bound notepad securely in hand, having painstakingly learned how to walk without making a single sound and how to exist in their space without ever becoming a nuisance. "Good evening, gentlemen. Are you perfectly ready to place your order?" she asked, with a carefully measured, incredibly polite tone that betrayed absolutely none of her physical exhaustion or internal financial panic. Samuel Montgomery barely lifted his dark, calculating eyes for a fraction of a second to acknowledge her presence, looking every bit the ruthless corporate titan at exactly 34 years old. Wearing a flawless $6,000 bespoke Tom Ford suit that fit his athletic frame like a second skin, his square jawline was frequently described by leading financial magazines as thoroughly implacable and terrifying. Sarah, at 26 years old, possessed a beautifully delicate face, with remarkably strong, proud features, directly inherited from her resilient grandmother, paired with deep brown eyes that guarded entire libraries of unspoken tragic knowledge. She clearly did not pass his silent, highly judgmental test, as he completely ignored her polite greeting and abruptly turned toward his 3 European corporate guests, all wearing equally expensive, perfectly tailored business suits. Just let her wait in silence. The foolish waitresses in this arrogant city actually think their pathetic time matters to people like us, he remarked with a viciously dismissive sneer, deliberately speaking in highly fluent Russian. The European businessman chuckled softly, sharing a polite, complicit laugh that belonged exclusively to incredibly privileged men who had never been forced to wait for anything in their entire effortlessly wealthy lives. Sarah bravely maintained her flawless, completely professional smile, though her knuckles turned stark white as she tightly gripped her order pad, silently swallowing hard and counting the agonizing, painfully slow seconds inside her head. She patiently waited for 15 seconds, then 30 seconds, and finally 45 seconds, refusing to show even a single hint of the burning humiliation that threatened to completely overwhelm her professional composure. One of the European guests, a wealthy German executive sporting a neatly trimmed blonde beard, gave her a discreet, slightly apologetic hand signal, clearly feeling a tiny pang of guilt for his host's incredible rudeness. Samuel immediately ignored his colleague's basic courtesy and simply continued speaking in rapid Russian, gesturing broadly with his manicured hands and laughing obnoxiously at an exclusive inside joke that only their elite circle could comprehend. Sarah felt a sudden intense wave of heat rise rapidly up her neck, born not of embarrassment, but of a deep, boiling rage. But she calmly took a slow, highly controlled breath to steady her racing heart. She silently counted to 10 in Spanish, then in English, and finally in French, forcefully pushing her simmering emotions back down into the deepest, darkest corners of her disciplined mind. Finally, Samuel slowly turned his head toward her with the highly calculated, agonizing, deliberate speed of a cruel predator who thoroughly enjoys making his helpless subordinates suffer for his own sick amusement. "Are you actually still standing there like an idiot?" he asked aggressively, to which she calmly replied, prompting him to maliciously switch between French Mandarin and German to deliver an incredibly complex, highly contradictory dinner order. Despite his vicious multilingual assault explicitly designed to publicly humiliate her, Sarah effortlessly wrote down every single item, calmly confirming the entire complicated request in absolutely flawless accent-free Spanish, without missing a single beat. Furious that his cruel game had failed, Samuel leaped to his feet so violently that his heavy mahogany chair screeched loudly against the pristine marble floor, drawing the shocked attention of the entire dining room. Ethan, the cowardly restaurant manager, rushed over instantly, trembling with fear, as Samuel loudly demanded that Sarah be fired immediately, explicitly, shouting that worthless people like her were only meant to scrub dirty floors. Remembering her grandmother's wise words about carrying true dignity internally, Sarah calmly handed her notepad to the sweating manager, turned around, and walked out into the freezing New York night, with her head held exceptionally high. Sarah walked 17 long, incredibly exhausting city blocks through the freezing, relentless rain that violently battered the dark, unforgiving concrete streets of Lower Manhattan without a single umbrella to shield her. She simply did not possess enough money for the subway fare, having desperately spent her final $3 on the morning bus ride just to reach her miserable, ultimately doomed restaurant shift on time. The icy, pouring water thoroughly soaked her thin uniform, completely ruined her already tight shoes, and plastered her dark hair to her face, yet she, surprisingly, did not feel the bitter freezing cold at all. She felt absolutely nothing except the crushing, suffocating weight of the profound humiliation playing on an endless, highly torturous loop inside her tired mind, as Samuel's cruel words aggressively chased her through the shadows. She finally arrived at her dilapidated Brooklyn apartment building well past 11 o'clock at night, heavily dreading the long, agonizing climb up the 5 flights of structurally decaying, incredibly steep wooden stairs. The dark hallway was characterized by peeling, water-damaged paint, completely broken light fixtures, and a permanent, highly overwhelming stench of deep-fried food that seemed to hopelessly cling to the very walls of the building. On the 3rd floor, her friendly neighbor Rose, a 60-year-old woman perpetually clad in a faded pink bathrobe, popped her head out and immediately offered to brew a hot cup of tea for the freezing girl. Sarah politely declined the warm, generous offer, explaining that she desperately needed to check on her waiting grandmother, and wearily continued her exhausting journey up to the fifth and final floor of the miserable building. She pulled out her heavily worn copy of the apartment key, which habitually jammed in the rusty, highly compromised lock, and aggressively pushed the heavy wooden door open with her bruised, aching shoulder. The tiny apartment instantly smelled strongly of dried chamomile flowers and soothing menthol rub consisting of 2 minuscule bedrooms and a cramped, heavily stained bathroom with a permanently leaking, highly annoying shower head. The furniture was undeniably old and visibly worn, yet meticulously clean, lovingly covered with beautiful hand-knitted lace doilies that bravely attempted to add a tiny touch of faded, desperate elegance to the crushing poverty. Grace Mitchell was sitting quietly in her usual spot, an ancient faded green velvet armchair, with her severely swollen, highly arthritic hands resting gently upon a thick knitted shawl as she waited for her granddaughter. At 83 years old, Grace's hair was entirely white and pulled back into a severe tight bun, but her striking honey-colored eyes still saw far too much of the world's incredibly harsh, highly unforgiving truths. "Sarah, you are completely soaked to the bone, and your eyes are terribly red. Tell me exactly what happened tonight," Grace demanded softly, but with an underlying unbreakable firmness that commanded absolute immediate respect. Sarah allowed her heavy, cheap purse to drop onto the scuffed floor, kicked off her utterly ruined shoes, sat directly on the faded rug, and finally let the hot, incredibly bitter tears fall completely freely. She wept in total absolute silence, exactly as she had painstakingly learned to do during the incredibly hard, highly traumatic years following the tragic, completely unexpected death of her beloved hardworking parents. After 20 agonizingly long minutes of silent, heartbreaking weeping, Sarah finally found her voice and meticulously recounted absolutely everything, detailing every single cruel word, and the horrific, highly public humiliation she had endured. She tearfully described the flawless Russian translation, the French wine order, the Mandarin appetizers, Samuel's monstrously cruel, highly arrogant smile, and the manager Ethan's completely pathetic, highly predictable corporate cowardice in the face of wealth. When she finally finished her tragic story, Grace let out a long, incredibly heavy sigh that seemed to carry several dark, highly painful decades of suppressed, completely unacknowledged generational sorrow and absolute grief. "That horribly arrogant, viciously cruel man, you said his last name is Montgomery?" Grace asked, her fragile voice suddenly dropping to a highly dangerous, terrifyingly calm whisper that made the tiny room feel instantly colder. Grace slowly pushed herself up from the velvet chair with immense, highly visible physical difficulty, her damaged knees loudly popping as she shuffled incredibly slowly toward her tiny, severely cramped bedroom in total silence. She returned exactly 5 minutes later, carrying a heavily rusted, incredibly old metal lockbox, roughly the exact size of a standard shoebox, and let it drop onto the fragile coffee table with a loud, resounding thud. "This right here is your true, highly guarded family inheritance," Grace declared, simply pulling a tiny brass key from a long silver chain hidden deep beneath her thick, deeply faded wool sweater. Sarah watched, in completely stunned, breathless silence, as her grandmother unlocked the ancient box, revealing a massive stack of heavily yellowed legal documents, highly fragile vintage photographs, and carefully preserved, deeply faded newspaper clippings. Grace carefully extracted a highly fragile, officially stamped document with utmost reverence, gently unfolding it across the small table, and firmly ordered her bewildered granddaughter to read the complex, highly formal text aloud. It was an official, heavily certified property deed, formally dated the 15th of March 1920, explicitly proving that Edward Davis Mitchell was the absolute owner of a magnificent, sprawling estate in the beautiful Hudson Valley. Your great-grandfather owned exactly 400 pristine acres. He employed 50 local families, paid them exceptionally well, and even built a wonderful, highly successful school specifically for their young, eager children. Grace explained tearfully. The massive, beautiful estate had been the absolute crown jewel of their proud family, a highly prosperous, completely self-sustaining haven of education, profound agricultural success, and deep, highly respected community leadership. Grace then pulled out a much more recent legal document explicitly dated 1994, explaining that her late husband, Richard Davis, had been brutally swindled out of the entire estate by a corrupt lawyer named Frank Montgomery. Frank had manipulated the trusting schoolteacher into signing highly fraudulent transfer documents, leading to their violent, completely illegal eviction, which ultimately caused Richard to tragically die of a completely broken heart merely 6 months later. Realizing that Samuel Montgomery's massive, highly celebrated billion-dollar hotel empire was entirely built upon the stolen, violently acquired lands of her own family, Sarah felt a terrifying, ice-cold fire instantly ignite within her soul. She solemnly vowed right then and there to meticulously gather every single piece of evidence and absolutely obliterate Samuel Montgomery's entire luxurious existence with the cold, highly undeniable, completely unvarnished historical truth. Sarah did not sleep a single second that entire highly agonizing night, choosing instead to remain perfectly seated on the cold living room floor until exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, completely surrounded by fragile documents. She meticulously read through every single official property deed, carefully analyzed every vintage photograph, and reviewed dozens of beautifully handwritten letters penned by her great-grandfather Edward in 1935, completely absorbing her family's lost legacy. At exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, she made an unshakable, deeply profound decision that she was absolutely not going to hide from the world, nor quietly accept the cowardly, entirely unofficial dismissal from the restaurant. She thoroughly showered, carefully ironed the pristine spare uniform she kept meticulously stored for emergencies, pulled her dark hair back into a flawlessly tight professional bun, and marched directly back to the towering Manhattan skyscraper. She arrived at the highly exclusive restaurant at exactly 10:30 in the morning, causing Ethan, the manager, to instantly turn as pale as a fresh, highly bleached bedsheet the exact moment she walked through the doors. "I came here to successfully complete my scheduled shift. Mr. Montgomery is absolutely not my legal employer, you are, and you entirely failed to formally terminate my employment contract last night," Sarah stated with razor-sharp efficiency. Ethan weakly opened his mouth to argue, but quickly closed it, nodding pathetically like a frightened little mouse, before rapidly disappearing into the safety of the bustling kitchen to completely avoid any further highly uncomfortable confrontation. Sarah meticulously checked the day's exclusive reservation list, her heart giving a massive, highly violent leap when she spotted a high-profile booking for Table 14 at exactly 1:55 in the afternoon for Samuel Montgomery. At precisely 1:55, the heavy, highly polished glass doors opened, and Samuel proudly strutted in, radiating the obnoxious, entirely unearned arrogance of a man completely convinced that his vast stolen wealth made him totally invincible. Following closely behind him were 6 incredibly powerful businessmen, including a completely new face, a broad-shouldered, highly imposing Russian-American billionaire named David Volkov, who possessed piercing blue eyes and a highly intimidating, powerful presence. Samuel stopped dead in his incredibly expensive tracks the absolute second he saw Sarah, standing proudly by his reserved table, immediately shouting loudly and aggressively, demanding that she be violently thrown out of the luxury building. However, before Ethan could even utter a single pathetic apology, David stepped forward, firmly stating in incredibly fluent, highly educated Spanish that he actually strongly preferred Sarah to act as their dedicated server for the afternoon. This incredibly professional young lady brilliantly demonstrated last night that she is highly capable and impressively multilingual, and I greatly appreciate highly competent, entirely fearless people," David declared, politely introducing himself directly to Sarah. Samuel's face instantly turned a violent, highly explosive shade of dark crimson, aggressively insisting that she was nothing but a lowly, completely insignificant servant, completely missing the dangerous, icy glare that David shot in his direction. When Samuel spitefully attempted to mock Sarah by violently barking highly complex corporate complaints in Russian, assuming she would eventually break down and cry, Sarah simply waited with a perfectly calm, highly terrifying professional smile. She waited exactly 15 seconds before flawlessly responding in perfect, heavily Moscow-accented Russian, politely asking if the gentlemen were finally ready to order their incredibly expensive, highly customized gourmet meals for the afternoon. The stunned, highly palpable silence that immediately fell over the entire dining room was gloriously absolute. David let out a massive, highly booming laugh of pure, unadulterated delight, while the French executive politely clapped his hands. Samuel stood up so violently that his heavy mahogany chair crashed loudly onto the marble floor, his entire body trembling with an uncontrollable, furious rage as he aggressively accused Sarah of maliciously lying to him. "You directly asked a specific question, and I simply chose not to reveal all of my extensive, highly educated linguistic capabilities to a remarkably rude, completely classless patron," Sarah replied with terrifying, ice-cold calmness. Realizing that his massive $200 million international investment deal heavily depended on David's highly volatile approval, Samuel was forcefully backed into a highly humiliating, completely inescapable corporate corner in front of his peers. David forcefully intervened, making it absolutely crystal clear to the furious billionaire that unless he immediately issued a sincere, highly public apology to the waitress, he had insulted the massive corporate investment, was completely dead. Humiliated beyond human belief in front of a completely silent, packed restaurant, Samuel painfully forced the bitter, highly reluctant words from his tightly clenched jaw, muttering a highly pathetic apology that Sarah graciously, coldly accepted. When the incredibly tense meal finally concluded, David discreetly slipped a sleek, heavy ivory business card into Sarah's apron pocket, accompanied by a highly generous $500 tip to explicitly reward her incredible bravery. Leaving the restaurant completely, utterly humiliated, Samuel angrily whispered a highly vicious, incredibly dark threat of total, absolute destruction as he stormed out of the building, completely unaware of the massive storm approaching him. Sarah returned to her small employee locker at the exact end of her shift, only to find a cold, highly impersonal, unsigned manila envelope unceremoniously stuffed inside, officially terminating her employment at the luxury restaurant. The typed letter bluntly informed her that her dedicated services were absolutely no longer required, officially warning her that any future attempt to re-enter the luxurious premises would be aggressively prosecuted as highly illegal criminal trespassing. Feeling a profound, highly overwhelming sense of relief that the suffocating charade was finally over, she calmly walked out into the busy city streets and pulled out the elegant ivory business card David had given her. She decisively dialed the international number, holding her breath, until David's deep voice answered on the third ring, immediately inviting her to his lavish presidential suite at the prestigious Four Seasons Hotel to discuss a mutual arrangement. The highly prestigious Four Seasons Hotel in Midtown Manhattan was the absolute polar opposite of Sarah's decaying, highly compromised Brooklyn apartment, overflowing with pristine imported marble blinding gold fixtures and massive, incredibly expensive floral arrangements. Sarah rode the completely silent, mirror-lined elevator up to the 18th floor, marveling at the sheer, completely obscene luxury of Suite 1804. Which featured a beautiful grand piano and a breathtaking panoramic view. David, casually barefoot with a heavy crystal glass of highly expensive amber whiskey in his large hand, gestured for her to sit on the rich Italian leather sofa, immediately launching into his highly complex corporate explanation. He bluntly revealed that Samuel Montgomery had maliciously stolen exactly $3 million from his firm during a highly complex corporate transaction in Moscow, and he had been patiently waiting to utterly destroy the Montgomery empire. Sarah's hands tightly gripped her crystal water glass as she finally unleashed the heavy, completely heartbreaking truth, detailing the horrific, highly illegal 1994 land theft, orchestrated entirely by Frank Montgomery, against her incredibly trusting grandfather. She spoke passionately for nearly an hour, meticulously detailing the forged documents, the sudden, highly violent police eviction, the tragic death of Richard Davis, and Grace's 3 decades of silent, agonizing suffering in crushing urban poverty. When she finally finished, David sat completely frozen in genuine shock, his expensive whiskey entirely forgotten, thoroughly disgusted by the horrific revelation that his arrogant business rival was completely financed by violently stolen, absolutely blood-soaked ancestral land. He immediately proposed a highly dangerous, intensely secretive alliance. He would completely finance the absolute best, most ruthless legal team in the country. And in return, Sarah would sell him a 30% stake once victorious. 3 days later, Sarah formally delivered every single piece of ancient, incredibly fragile documentation to a highly elite team of 5 ruthless corporate lawyers that David had specifically hired for this incredibly monumental, highly sensitive task. These brilliant, highly expensive legal minds locked themselves inside a secure, entirely windowless conference room, meticulously analyzing every single word, official seal, and faded signature for 2 grueling, incredibly exhausting weeks of non-stop, highly caffeinated investigation. Eventually, they discovered a tiny, highly technical, yet absolutely devastating legal flaw. The specific state notary who had officially certified the fraudulent transfer documents had actually been temporarily suspended from practicing law during that precise month. According to strict state property laws, any legal document certified by a suspended official was completely and utterly null and void, legally proving that the massive Hudson Valley estate still entirely belonged to the Davis-Mitchell family. However, Samuel Montgomery's highly paid private investigators had quickly discovered Sarah's secret meetings with David, prompting the terrified billionaire to aggressively order a highly illegal immediate midnight break-in at Grace's specific 5th-floor Brooklyn apartment. At precisely 3:17 in the morning, Grace Mitchell suddenly awoke her finely tuned survival instincts, screaming that a highly dangerous, completely unauthorized intruder was desperately searching through her worn wooden furniture with a small flashlight. She quietly retreated safely, locked her bedroom door, and immediately dialed the emergency contact number David had provided, trusting entirely in the highly specialized, heavily armed security team that was covertly watching her building. 90 seconds later, Victor David's massive, heavily scarred head of personal security flawlessly tackled the hired burglar, violently subduing him and happily securing a fully recorded, highly incriminating confession regarding Samuel's completely illegal, desperate corporate orders. The very next morning, Victor safely escorted Sarah and Grace to a highly discreet, perfectly secure location in the city to meet a 92-year-old woman named Catherine Reynolds, who had been Richard's loyal, deeply terrified secretary. Catherine wept bitterly as she emotionally confessed to directly witnessing Frank Montgomery's brutal, highly manipulative fraud, tearfully admitting she had accepted a $100,000 bribe to remain completely silent because her children were starving. I watched him quietly slip the highly fraudulent transfer documents into the stack of standard updates, and when he explicitly threatened my life, I took the dirty money and watched your grandfather lose absolutely everything. She sobbed. Grace gently held the weeping woman's incredibly fragile hands, firmly assuring her that while her past silence was highly damaging, her current bravery would finally destroy the corrupt empire and beautifully restore their stolen family legacy. In a truly stunning, completely game-changing twist, Catherine slowly walked to her old closet and retrieved a highly preserved, carefully hidden folder containing absolute, completely undeniable proof of the massive 1994 corporate conspiracy. She had secretly photocopied the original, completely unadulterated documents before they were illegally altered, and she had successfully intercepted a highly incriminating, personally signed letter from Frank Montgomery explicitly proving the massive, highly illegal notary bribery. These explosive, perfectly preserved documents completely sealed the absolute legal doom of the Montgomery Empire, forever providing George Vance, the highly brilliant lead attorney, with the exact ammunition needed to completely obliterate Samuel in federal court. With the burglar's recorded confession securely in hand and Catherine's incredibly powerful historical evidence verified by top experts, the highly elaborate, completely inescapable legal trap was finally perfectly set for the arrogant, entirely doomed billionaire. Samuel Montgomery had not slept a single minute in 3 excruciatingly long days, effectively transforming his pristine 40th floor executive office into a highly chaotic, smoke-filled war bunker completely littered with scattered legal briefs and panic. His senior corporate attorney, an incredibly expensive 60-year-old legal shark named Arthur Carter, sat directly across the massive mahogany desk, delivering the absolutely catastrophic news regarding the highly aggressive, completely unexpected civil lawsuit filed against them. The audio recording of you explicitly ordering the violent residential break-in is entirely authentic, and the case has been officially assigned to the notoriously incorruptible, absolutely ruthless Judge Margaret Thompson. Arthur stated with grave, terrifying finality. Realizing that his immense wealth and powerful political connections were suddenly entirely useless, Samuel made a highly desperate, completely unforgivable decision. Totally disregarding Arthur's frantic, highly desperate pleas to simply surrender the stolen properties peacefully. Samuel covertly contacted a highly dangerous, completely professional underground hitman, explicitly offering him $500,000 to violently break into David Volkov's luxurious hotel suite and permanently silence anyone standing in his way. The completely unmemorable, cold-eyed assassin happily accepted the massive bounty, casually promising to deliver the incredibly valuable historical documents by early Friday morning, fully prepared to utilize lethal, entirely uncompromising force to achieve his highly illegal objective. At exactly 2:30 on Friday morning, the heavily armed hitman effortlessly picked the complex electronic lock of Suite 1804 at the Four Seasons, creeping silently into the pitch-black room with a suppressed handgun drawn. However, the suite was entirely empty of any documents. Instead, it was heavily rigged with hidden cameras, and Victor flawlessly tackled the intruder from the shadows, brutally breaking his nose and easily disarming him within seconds. Victor happily played the highly incriminating audio recordings of Samuel explicitly ordering the violent armed extraction, successfully forcing the bleeding, completely terrified hitman to fully confess to the massive conspiracy to avoid 20 years in prison. At exactly 8 o'clock that very same morning, while Samuel nervously paced his luxurious office, waiting for confirmation, a heavily armed team of federal police officers violently kicked open his expensive mahogany doors with absolute terrifying authority. They presented a massive stack of undeniable arrest warrants, officially charging the completely shocked billionaire with felony conspiracy to commit armed robbery, severe obstruction of justice, and explicitly hiring a professional, highly lethal contract killer. Slapped in cold steel handcuffs, he was humiliatingly paraded through his crowded corporate lobby, locking eyes with Sarah on the sidewalk, who looked at him with deep, devastating pity as his entire luxurious empire violently crumbled. During the incredibly explosive, highly publicized federal trial, dubbed the Trial of the Century, Sarah's brilliant attorney, George Vance, flawlessly presented the absolutely undeniable, highly devastating historical evidence to the completely silent, deeply captivated courtroom. He masterfully presented the suspended notary evidence, the completely authenticated 1920 property deeds, and called Catherine Reynolds to the stand, where the fragile 92-year-old woman delivered a highly emotional, completely devastating eyewitness testimony of the fraud. Arthur Carter attempted to aggressively cross-examine the elderly woman, but she firmly stood her ground, boldly declaring that she refused to die with a highly guilty conscience to protect an incredibly corrupt, completely unrepentant billionaire thief. The entire courtroom wept in absolute silence, as the true, highly horrific depth of the Montgomery family's boundless, incredibly toxic generational greed was thoroughly, highly publicly exposed for the entire world to clearly witness. In a final, highly dramatic legal maneuver, George Vance forcefully called Samuel Montgomery to the witness stand, aggressively confronting him with a heavily guarded, completely unreleased legal document, the final highly secretive last will of Frank Montgomery. George demanded that Samuel loudly read the specific, highly damning paragraph where his late father explicitly admitted to the horrific 1994 theft, desperately begging his son to return the stolen lands and deeply apologize. Samuel's voice cracked violently as he read the highly painful, deeply humiliating confession, completely admitting to the entire courtroom that he had willfully ignored his dying father's final wishes simply to fiercely protect his stolen, luxurious lifestyle. Judge Margaret Thompson immediately slammed her heavy wooden gavel, entirely nullifying the fraudulent property transfer, returning the 400 acres to Sarah, awarding $340 million in damages, and sending Samuel directly to federal prison. 6 incredibly transformative months after the explosive trial finally concluded, the massive, sprawling Hudson Valley estate finally breathed completely freely, once again entirely liberated from the dark, highly suffocating shadow of the corrupt Montgomery luxury empire. Sarah slowly walked across the lush, expansive green lawns, marveling at the incredible, highly historic architecture of the main mansion, feeling a deep, incredibly powerful genetic memory powerfully surging through her very veins with every single step. She had strategically sold 2 of the massive, highly profitable luxury resorts to foreign investors for an incredible $580 million, utilizing the massive, completely life-changing funds to beautifully enact her grandmother's ultimate long-held dream. The grandest, most historic hotel building was beautifully transformed into the Edward Davis Mitchell Cultural Center, serving as a massive, entirely free educational facility and a highly specialized legal refuge for deeply impoverished, highly vulnerable farming families. Grace Mitchell, now nearly 84 years old and looking incredibly peaceful, sat comfortably on a beautiful wrought iron bench beneath a massive century-old oak tree, tears of absolute profound joy streaming down her deeply wrinkled, highly expressive face. "You truly achieved the entirely impossible, my incredibly brave girl. Your grandfather is looking down right now, completely bursting with overwhelming, boundless pride," Grace whispered softly as Sarah gently sat beside her, holding her fragile hands. Lauren Mitchell, the highly energetic, incredibly smart new director of the expansive legal clinic, rushed over to enthusiastically inform Sarah that the first 5 desperate families had officially arrived to seek their entirely free, highly expert counsel. Sarah warmly greeted the incredibly humble, deeply hopeful farmers, firmly promising them that the brilliant legal team would fight relentlessly for their stolen lands, ensuring that horrific historical tragedies would absolutely never be successfully repeated again. Later that afternoon, Sarah received a heavily stamped official letter from the federal penitentiary system coldly informing her that Samuel Montgomery was currently serving his lengthy 5-year prison sentence, working the absolute lowest, most grueling kitchen job. She felt absolutely zero malicious joy upon reading the highly ironic, deeply poetic justice of his brutal punishment. Instead, she simply felt a profound, incredibly heavy sadness for the massive, tragic waste of human potential. That evening, David Volkov called from Moscow to happily inform her that he had successfully acquired Samuel's remaining European assets at an incredibly massive discount, formally offering Sarah his absolute, completely unwavering future support and eternal gratitude. She stood by the massive window of her beautifully restored ancestral bedroom, finally feeling completely at peace with her incredible, highly dangerous journey toward absolute, completely undeniable historical justice and true, lasting familial redemption. 5 highly successful, incredibly busy years later, the educational center was absolutely thriving with hundreds of fully funded, highly eager students. But the immense joy was deeply tempered by the incredibly peaceful passing of Grace Mitchell. She died quietly in her sleep at exactly 90 years old, surrounded by absolute love, and was lovingly buried beside her beloved husband Richard, on a quiet, incredibly beautiful green hill overlooking the vast restored estate. Shortly after the beautiful, highly emotional funeral concluded, a significantly aged, completely humbled man wearing very cheap, highly faded denim clothing slowly approached the quiet gravesite. It was Samuel Montgomery, newly released from federal prison seeking closure. He did not ask for impossible forgiveness, but rather tearfully presented the tattered page of his father's will, fully accepting his absolute, highly public ruin as the rightful, entirely deserved consequence of his monstrous, highly unforgivable actions. Sarah looked out over the sprawling, sunlit estate, deeply reflecting on the long, arduous journey that had brought her family back from the brink of absolute ruin and crushing multi-generational poverty. True justice, she finally understood with profound clarity, was never truly about seeking brutal, destructive revenge against those who had deeply wronged you in the past, as revenge is merely a highly toxic poison that destroys the vessel carrying it. True, lasting justice was fundamentally about bravely restoring the essential human dignity that had been so maliciously stolen and fiercely protecting the highly vulnerable from ever suffering the exact same heartbreaking, completely devastating fate. For older generations who have quietly weathered life's harshest storms and suffered profound, incredibly silent losses, the ultimate triumph is never found in the total destruction of an enemy, but in the miraculous, highly healing power of planting new seeds of hope. By firmly breaking the dark, insidious generational cycles of cruelty, she proved that immense wealth can never purchase a clean conscience, and demonstrated that a truly noble, forgiving heart can brilliantly transform even the darkest family history into a radiant beacon of enduring hope.